Envision yourself suddenly engulfed in a powerful current, surrounded by a whirlwind of water, tools, and fellow workers, all being swept through a dark, underwater pipeline. You're struggling to grasp the chaos around you, desperately holding your breath, with the overwhelming fear of imminent drowning. This was the terrifying reality for a group of 5 men during a catastrophic event known as the Paria diving disaster. Remarkably, only one of these men would survive to narrate the harrowing tale. Attached to one of the divers' suits was a GoPro camera, which captured the chilling sequence of events that unfolded. The footage it recorded is nothing short of horrifying. The date was February 25th, 2022. It started as a typical workday for the team at LMCS Diving, located in Pointe-à-Pierre. Their assignment was routine maintenance on a pipeline belonging to Paria Fuel, a government-operated oil company in Trinidad and Tobago. For the divers, Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurbin, Rishi Nagesar, and Chris Boudram, it was just another day on the job. Their task involved working on a section of the pipeline that was temporarily out of service. This pipeline formed a U-shape, connecting the point where oil tankers offload, known as Berth 5, to the refinery entrance at Berth 6. To carry out their repairs, they needed to isolate the pipeline from the surrounding seawater. They achieved this by placing a specialized habitat bell over the pipeline. This habitat was an 8-foot cube structure, positioned over the top part of the pipeline. By pumping air into this habitat, they were able to push the water away, creating a dry environment for them to work in. Inside this hyperbaric chamber, the divers could safely remove their diving equipment and use various tools to conduct complex repairs. Their primary task for the day involved the removal of an inflatable plug at Berth 6. This plug had been inserted almost 2 weeks earlier to safeguard the oil within the pipeline and prevent any hydrocarbons from leaking out. The plug created an airtight seal, holding back the pressure exerted by the habitat chamber above. Kazim Ali handed up a wrench to the team working around the pipeline, then joined them on the ledge to remove his diving gear. However, as soon as they began to loosen the valve on the plug, an unexpected and powerful force took hold. The moment the valve was opened, a torrent of water surged into the habitat and down the pipeline. This sudden influx of water created a vortex that dragged the men and their equipment into a chaotic descent through the pipeline. The event was so sudden and unexpected that the men could barely comprehend what was happening. In a stroke of luck, they ended up in a section of the pipeline that had an air pocket, allowing them to breathe. The GoPro camera captured the moments just before they were pulled in, and then everything went dark. The audio picked up the sounds of rustling and movement, followed by the men's voices as they began to shout to each other, disoriented and trapped in a pipeline that was supposed to be filled with crude oil. The tragic irony of the situation was that the very air that was allowing them to breathe was also responsible for the water vortex that had brought them to this predicament. So, under normal circumstances, removing the plug would have been a straightforward task. The air pressure in the habitat would have been pressing down on a dense column of oil, keeping everything stable. However, unbeknownst to them, there was a significant amount of air under the plug and much less oil in the pipeline than they had anticipated. As soon as the plug was deflated, the high-pressure air from the habitat rushed down the pipeline with immense force. This created a vacuum that pulled the men, along with their tools and scuba tanks, into the 30-inch pipeline. The sudden release of pressure from the habitat caused the ocean water to rush in violently, creating a whirlpool that engulfed the men in a chaotic mix of air, water, and tools. The 5 men found themselves in a desperate struggle to breathe amidst this turmoil. Chris Boudrum, the only survivor, later described the unimaginable experience of being sucked into an oil pipeline. He recalled the rapidity of the event, saying that he didn't even remember being pulled into the pipe. He only remembered hurtling through the pipeline at incredible speeds. He reached a point where he could no longer hold his breath, his throat burning from inhaling the toxic environment for too long. He described the experience as an unbelievable nightmare, his eyes burning every time he tried to open them, his throat in agony, his ears ringing, his body aching. In that moment, he resigned himself to the belief that he was going to die. Once the initial chaos had subsided, the men quickly assessed their situation. They confirmed that all 5 of them had been sucked into the pipe and were together. The reality of their situation was almost too unbelievable to comprehend. Understanding their location within the pipeline proved to be more challenging than expected. They were completely disoriented and had no idea how far they had been carried down the 200-foot-long pipeline, which was as long as 4 football fields. The pipeline had various undulations at weld seams and support points, creating elevations that allowed for the formation of air pockets. Once they had oriented themselves, it became clear that all of them were injured but alive. However, in their disoriented state, they couldn't agree on which direction would lead them back to Berth 6. After some discussion, they decided to link up and move as a group towards one end of the pipeline. The entire interior of the pipeline was coated with a thick layer of slippery oil sludge. Moving through this environment was exhausting. They had to fight against the oil, barely making any progress, all while dealing with broken bones, internal injuries, oil in their eyes and nostrils, and the overwhelming darkness. After struggling for about an hour, they encountered a new and terrifying problem. The seawater level inside the pipeline was rising. They were trying to keep their heads above water, but the first person in line noticed that his face was now only 6 inches from the top of the pipeline. Continuing in these conditions was impossible. Some of the men were seriously injured and couldn't move much longer. Chris Boudrum and Kazim Ali, who were leading the group, decided to hold their breath and see if they could find another pocket of air. They promised the others that they would fight to get out and return with help. The 2 men held their faces above the water for as long as they could, then held their breath and swam forward in search of air. Their struggle led them to a second air pocket closer to the riser pipe, which they hoped would lead them out. They were overjoyed to find 2 of their scuba tanks resting in this section. It seemed like they had everything they needed to make their escape. They were tempted to use both oxygen bottles to move through the next section, but Kazim's injuries were becoming more severe, and he was unable to move quickly. After some deliberation, they decided that Chris should take the remaining oxygen and attempt to swim to the end of the pipe to get help. Chris positioned the tank in front of him and pushed it along as he squeezed through the narrow 2.5-foot tube. As he approached the riser end of the pipe, he was struck by a terrifying thought. What if he was at Berth 5 instead of Berth 6? If that were the case, he would swim up nearly 60 feet only to encounter an inflated plug with no air and his oxygen tank nearly empty. He said a prayer and pushed off the bottom, hoping he was heading towards the surface. After more than 2 hours trapped in the pipeline, Chris was relieved to find himself at the top of the oily water at Berth 6. He banged on the pipe and screamed for help, trying to get the attention of the rest of the ship's crew. Eventually, one of the searchers found him and helped him out of the water using a chain. Chris was overwhelmed and exhausted. He explained that there were air pockets in the line and that all the men were still alive. He was rushed to the hospital, but not before informing the rescuers that there was air in the pipeline and that the men were injured but alive. Up until this point, the other members of LMCS weren't sure if the men could even be alive. They assumed that the pipeline was filled with oil and that the men would have drowned within minutes. They also knew that any oxygen tanks would last up to an hour each. It had been more than 2 hours since the men had been sucked into the pipeline, but finally, there was a glimmer of hope. Once Chris explained the situation, divers in the water tapped on the pipe at different locations and received tapping responses from inside. The trapped men must have felt an overwhelming sense of relief, knowing that someone was aware they were inside. They knew that professional divers and all kinds of equipment would be on the ship above them, including oxygen tanks, ropes, lights, and help. Hour after hour, they waited to see a glimmer of light or hear the metal clang of oxygen tanks coming down, but they saw nothing. They heard nothing. Not only were they suffering from the injuries they sustained in the initial flush, but they were also struggling to breathe the acrid, oily air. Each hour that passed increased the carbon dioxide content of their limited air supply, making breathing more and more challenging. And so, they waited. No matter how the debacle of the non-rescue came about, it is a desperately sad reality that these men were just a few hundred feet from salvation, but no one ever came. They struggled in pain, knocked for attention, and attempted to move themselves to the exit. It must have been a crushing realization after days stuck in the oily pipe that no one was coming. The actions taken by LMCS, Paria Fuel, their sister company Heritage, and the Coast Guard are much debated. It is claimed by some that Paria prevented divers from entering the pipe to save the other men. Paria claims that there was no viable plan to get the men out without risking more lives. Some believe that the men were certainly dead and that the banging was from something else. The Coast Guard, LMCS, and family members who were professional divers all have their own version of the events. The facts that cannot be denied are these. 4 men were alive at 5 o'clock on Friday when Chris Budram was rescued. Many people agree that they heard banging on the pipes from inside for nearly 48 hours before it stopped. After the bodies had been recovered, 2 autopsies were performed. Though the autopsies did not agree on the time of death, it was clear that all the men lived until various times on Saturday, and some appear to have lived until Monday. We are not sure if the men succumbed to their injuries, ran out of breathable air, or even drowned trying to swim to one of the pipe exits. A commission of inquiry was formed in Trinidad and Tobago. Their findings are scheduled to be released in August of 2023. The Paria diving disaster remains a haunting reminder of the dangers faced by underwater workers and the critical importance of safety and emergency response in such high-risk environments. If you found this story as gripping and insightful as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel for more content like this. Your support helps us continue to uncover and share these important stories. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more compelling content.